Before there was life, before there was thought, before there was even silence, there was the universe, not as we know it, not as a starry night, not even as darkness, but as pure potential, a point smaller than imagination, denser than truth itself. And then, in an instant that wasn't really an instant, it expanded, the Big Bang, a shattering so absolute that time itself began to count. Space unfolded, matter condensed, and from the roar of creation came nothing that could hear it. Because in this newborn universe there were no witnesses, no eyes to see, no minds to wonder, no beings to ask what had just happened. It was an existence without awareness, a cosmos without consciousness, a dream with no dreamer. And yet, buried within the raw equations of physics, within the dance of energy and entropy, something was set in motion, something that, billions of years later, would learn to ask the question, why am I aware? For now, there was only chaos. Particles collided and scattered, stars exploded before they could form, matter bent itself into the strange symmetry of natural law. This was not creation in any human sense. There was no purpose, no intention, only unfolding. Atoms drifted, galaxies spiraled, gravity sculpted the void into vast oceans of fire. But even in that silence, the seeds of awareness were being sown, not by will, but by inevitability, because order, however fragile, has a strange habit of emerging from chaos. 1. The universe begins, but with no one to witness it. We imagine the early universe as noise and light, but in truth it was emptier than our minds can comprehend. For 38,000 years, photons ricocheted off particles in a cosmic fog. There was no up or down, no here or there, only a plasma so dense that light itself was trapped, waiting for the universe to cool enough to breathe. When it finally did, light broke free, racing across the expanding void. That first light still travels through space today, whispering the memory of beginnings in the faint hum of cosmic background radiation. But even then, when the cosmos was newborn, glowing, alive with physics, there was still no perception. The stars did not know they were shining. The galaxies did not know they were beautiful. The universe existed, but it could not feel itself. It was like a body without a nervous system, moving without knowing it moves. And yet, within that blind dance, something extraordinary was happening. The laws of physics, unfeeling, mechanical, ruthless, were quietly sculpting the conditions that would one day allow consciousness to bloom. Stars, those nuclear furnaces of the void, were the universe's first alchemists. They forged hydrogen into helium, helium into carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, the very ingredients that would later build brains, dreams, and the concept of self. In a sense, every supernova was a cosmic heartbeat, pumping the elements of awareness into the veins of the galaxy. When a star died, it scattered the raw material for life into the dark, as if saying, "You will carry on what I cannot." And so, long before neurons fired, the universe began writing the chemistry of consciousness, atom by atom, explosion by explosion. 2. The accidental architect, physics and the seeds of awareness. If you could stand outside time and watch the universe unfold, you would see that nothing about it seems personal, yet everything about it seems inevitable. Stars are not conscious, but they build the ingredients for consciousness. Gravity has no mind, but it sculpts galaxies that cradle life. Physics itself has no purpose, but it creates the conditions for purpose to emerge. And so, through the quiet machinery of natural law, matter began to organize itself. Entropy, the great driver of disorder, didn't just tear things apart, it also set the rules for how systems could sustain temporary order. Within those temporary islands of order, those flickers of pattern against chaos, life would one day appear. It's easy to think of consciousness as something separate from physics, but perhaps it's better understood as physics that has learned to observe itself. Just as a river carves the land and then reflects the sky, the universe shaped itself until one day its reflection looked back. There's a kind of poetry in inevitability. inevitability. Given enough time, hydrogen atoms, those simple building blocks, will fuse, explode, scatter, recombine, and eventually form something that can wonder about its own origin. And if you trace that chain backward from mind to molecule, molecule to atom, atom to star, you find that the birth of consciousness was written into the behavior of matter itself, not as destiny, but as possibility. The cosmos didn't intend to wake up. It simply followed its own rules so long and so far that eventually the rules learned to dream. The chemistry of the first spark. 4 billion years ago, on a small blue planet orbiting a modest star, the universe performed its most mysterious experiment yet. On Earth, once molten and hostile, something began to stir. Molecules, drifting in shallow pools or under volcanic vents, started to interact. They combined, broke apart, reassembled, and somehow, against impossible odds, they began to replicate. Life, if you could call it that, was born not from divine lightning, but from chemistry's stubborn curiosity. In the beginning, there was no thought, no feeling, only movement and mimicry. Molecules that could copy themselves survived a little longer than those that couldn't. Patterns that were stable persisted, and through endless repetition, something extraordinary happened. Matter began to store information about itself. This was the first whisper of memory, the faintest hint of intention. And though these early molecules knew nothing, they behaved as if they did, turning random reactions into primitive decision-making. When a molecule chose to bind or not to bind, when it responded differently to heat, light, or pressure, the first neurons of the universe were being rehearsed, not in brains, but in chemical interactions. Life, then, was not the beginning of consciousness, but a continuation of physics in a new language. Where once the universe spoke in energy and gravity, it now began whispering in chemistry and code. And through those whispers, the first echoes of awareness began to form. Imagine the timeline. The universe has existed for nearly 10 billion years before life takes its first breath. 10 billion years of silence, 10 billion years of stars burning themselves into ash so that one day something could notice. When those first self-replicating molecules flickered into existence, the silence of the cosmos was broken, not by sound, but by sensitivity. A system had appeared that could respond to its environment. That response, however faint, was the birth of experience, because experience, at its core, is not about thought or reflection. It is about difference, the ability to detect change, to feel warmth versus cold, light versus dark, danger versus safety. That was the first primitive awareness in the universe. Not the poetry of consciousness we know now, but the raw physics of perception. The moment a molecule noticed a difference, the universe noticed itself. Over eons, those molecules became cells. Cells became colonies. Colonies learned to cooperate, to specialize, to communicate. From chaos came cooperation. From cooperation came complexity. And from complexity came a strange phenomenon, purpose. Not the grand human kind of purpose, but the molecular desire to continue existing. Each step of evolution was the universe trying a new way of being aware. Each failure was a forgotten experiment. Each success, a new instrument through which reality could perceive itself. And so, by the time the first cell divided, the universe had taken its first conscious breath. Not through words, not through thought, but through sensation. That spark, fragile, accidental, unstoppable, was the beginning of everything we call life, mind, and meaning. The stars had burned for billions of years, but it was only now, through these tiny living systems, that the universe began to feel its own fire. Every cell, every breath, every mind that would come after would carry this legacy to turn chaos into pattern, pattern into perception, perception into thought. We are the descendants of that first spark, walking chemistry, conscious stardust. The earth turns, blue and breathing, volcanoes hiss, oceans churn, lightning flickers over dark water, and in that electric chaos, tiny membranes tremble. They are alive, but they do not yet know it. They eat, divide, move, and die, but not with intention, only reaction. Still, something subtle is shifting, because buried in the chemistry of survival, a new ability is forming. To sense, the dawn of sensation. Before there were thoughts, before there were emotions, there was a simple question whispered by existence itself. Is this safe or dangerous? That question became the first form of awareness. Early life began to notice changes. Warmth, light, chemical gradients. Not notice in the human sense, but in the raw language of reaction. A molecule wobbles differently in heat than in cold. A cell retracts from acid, moves towards sugar. It has no brain, no nerve, no mind, but it feels the difference. The earth turns blue and breathing, volcanoes hiss, oceans churn, lightning flickers over dark water, and in that electric chaos, tiny membranes tremble. They are alive, but they do not yet know it. They eat, divide, move, and die, but not with intention, only reaction. Still, something subtle is shifting, because buried in the chemistry of survival, a new ability is forming: to sense. The dawn of sensation. Before there were thoughts, before there were emotions, there was a simple question whispered by existence itself. Is this safe or dangerous? That question became the first form of awareness. Early life began to notice changes. Warmth, light, chemical gradients. Not notice in the human sense, but in the raw language of reaction. A molecule wobbles differently in heat than in cold. A cell retracts from acid, moves toward sugar. It has no brain, no nerve, no mind, but it feels the difference. This was the birth of sensation. Not yet sight, not yet touch, but the dim beginning of what, billions of years later, we would call experience. The first senses were chemical. Molecules on cell surfaces acted as tiny antennae, detecting the surrounding world. When food was near, signals told the cell to move closer. When toxins threatened, it retreated. From that primitive feedback loop, attraction and avoidance, all later intelligence would unfold. Because at its core, consciousness is built on contrast. Pain and pleasure, light and dark, order and chaos. Without difference, there can be no perception. So when that first cell recognized contrast, when it felt better here and worse there, the seed of awareness took root. Imagine what this means. The universe, for the first time in all its vastness, began to feel itself. In a puddle of warm ocean water, under a sky with no eyes to see it, atoms forged in stars were now responding to their environment in a way that mattered. The cosmos had become self-sensitive. Those little sensations, meaningless to us but monumental in scale, were the first flickers of subjectivity, the first difference between what is and what is experienced. Over eons, these sensing cells grew more complex. They developed specialized membranes that could detect more specific signals: light, vibration, temperature. Each new adaptation added a layer to the tapestry of experience. Then one day, an extraordinary innovation appeared. Networks, cells began to communicate. One reaction triggered another. Chemical messages turned into electrical ones. And in that shift, something new was born. A system that could coordinate sensations. That system was the beginning of a nervous system. The nervous system. The universe builds a brain. At first, these networks were simple. A few cells passing signals down a chain. But as life grew in complexity, so did its need to respond to the world faster, smarter, more efficiently. Jellyfish developed webs of nerve cells that allowed them to pulse through the sea. Worms evolved cords that could direct movement. The first brains were nothing like ours, just clusters of neurons handling survival tasks: find food, avoid danger, reproduce. But inside that simplicity, evolution had discovered something profound: a feedback loop that could store, process, and react. The universe, through biology, had built its first computers. Think of what a neuron is: a tiny cell that can fire, transmit a signal, and then reset. On its own, it's nothing special, but connect a few billion of them together, and something miraculous emerges: behavior that seems to have intention. When a creature moves toward the light, when it remembers where danger hides, when it learns, that's not chaos, that's coordination. And coordination at scale becomes consciousness. Neurons became nature's way of feeling faster. They allowed patterns of sensation to build on each other. Not just a single moment of reaction, but continuity across time. Memory was born. And with memory came anticipation. Now a creature could not only react to what is, it could prepare for what might be. It could avoid a predator it had seen before. It could remember where food had been found. It could dream in the smallest, simplest way of the next moment. That dream, the simulation of future experience, was the first spark of thought. In every evolutionary step, the cosmos was adding another layer of awareness to itself, from molecules to cells, from cells to nerves, from nerves to brains. Each step made the universe more capable of reflection. Each step made the universe more capable of reflection. At first, the reflection was purely instinctual: move, flee, eat, survive. But even instinct is a form of knowing. A jellyfish may not ponder the stars, but it knows how to exist. And that knowing, that continuity of perception, is consciousness in its most primitive, beautiful form. We often think of the mind as something separate from the body, but in truth, the body was the mind's first experiment. Sensation wasn't invented to make life interesting. It was invented to make life possible, to move through the world without collapsing into chaos, to learn which energies nourish and which destroy. Consciousness began not as a philosopher, but as a navigator of existence. The nervous system became a bridge between the outer universe and the inner one that was starting to take shape. Each new sensory system, vision, hearing, touch, was another window through which the cosmos could perceive itself. When light-sensitive cells evolved into eyes, for the first time the universe saw itself reflected. Mountains, oceans, skies, all that beauty existed long before, but only now was it truly experienced. The eye turned starlight into awareness, and in that act the stars became conscious of their own glow. But awareness is expensive. Every new layer of sensation, every new neuron demanded more energy, more complexity, more maintenance. To sustain awareness, organisms had to become clever. Evolution became a sculptor of intelligence, trimming, testing, refining. Only those systems that balanced sensitivity with survival endured. Too little awareness and life missed opportunities. Too much, and it became overwhelmed. That delicate balance would shape every species to come, including the one that would one day wonder about all this. As nervous systems grew, something else began to happen. Signals weren't just passing from stimulus to response anymore. They were looping back. A creature could sense its own sensations. It could feel itself feeling this feedback. Awareness folding in on itself was the beginning of what we call subjectivity. The line between world and self had been drawn. A jellyfish doesn't know it's a jellyfish. A bird doesn't contemplate flight. But somewhere along that path, evolution laid the groundwork for a question that no other planet may ever have asked. What am I? Before that question could be spoken, though, the machinery had to evolve further. The universe needed a brain complex enough to model itself, not just to feel, but to know it feels. And for that, evolution took billions of years, refining nerve nets into spines, brains, and eventually minds. But the direction was already set. The moment sensation appeared, the moment feeling became part of the equation, the destiny of the universe changed. It was no longer just expanding in space, it was expanding in awareness. Every creature that evolved, from the smallest worm to the first fish, was another experiment in the architecture of consciousness. Each neural connection was a line in the cosmos's sketch of its own reflection. Each spark of feeling, a pixel in the grand picture of understanding. And somewhere inside this evolutionary storm, a pattern emerged that would soon transform everything. Brains that could not only sense the world, but imagine it. That leap from feeling to imagining was coming next. But it all began here, with the first flicker of sensation in a cell, the first electric pulse in a primitive nerve, the first vibration of awareness through a living body. When the universe built its first nervous system, it built the first mirror. Not a perfect one, a trembling biological mirror made of salt and electricity, but enough for existence to finally see the outline of itself. Feeling was the dawn of knowing. Sensation was the root of all thought. Every neuron that fires today in your brain is a continuation of that first pulse of awareness in ancient oceans. You are not separate from the universe learning to feel. You are that process, still unfolding. And the story is far from over. Because next, the universe won't just feel or move, it will realize. It will look into its own reflection and whisper, I am. The earth is now a symphony of life. Forests breathe, oceans teem, insects hum. The nervous systems that began as faint sparks in the ocean have multiplied into infinite forms: eyes, wings, claws, lungs, brains. Life is no longer just surviving, it is competing, adapting, exploring. And yet, despite all this brilliance, the world is still quiet on the inside. There is sensation, but not yet introspection. Creatures see, hear, touch, and smell, but they do not know they are seeing, hearing, touching, or smelling. The lights are on, but no one is home. That's about to change. 6. The first glimpse of self. Somewhere in this living chaos, in a small, frightened mammal crouching beneath the trees, in a primate grooming another by the river, a new kind of thought flickers. It's not about food or danger or mating, it's something stranger, something recursive, a spark that says, that's me. The universe, after billions of years, has just recognized its own reflection. Self-awareness. It seems simple now, we take it for granted, but it's one of the most improbable phenomena in the cosmos. It's the moment perception folds inward, when the brain, built to model the outside world, suddenly models itself. Evolution didn't design this on purpose. It was a side effect, a beautiful accident of complexity, brains that could predict others' behavior. Predators, prey, rivals found an advantage. They started simulating other minds. What is she thinking? What will he do next? But in learning to model others, these creatures accidentally learned to model themselves. Mirror neurons, cells that fire both when you perform an action and when you see another do it, became the biological spark of empathy and later identity. To understand another, the brain had to imagine being another. And in that act of imagination, the idea of self was born. A chimp looks into a river and recognizes its reflection. A dolphin recognizes its own sound. An elephant mourns its dead, aware of loss. These are not instincts, they are intimations of selfhood, moments where awareness becomes aware of itself, and with that awareness comes the weight of existence. Because to know I am is also to know I will end. Self-awareness is the most magnificent and the most painful gift evolution ever gave. The universe, through us, gained the ability to feel its own mortality. But before the sorrow of death came the wonder of imagination. Once the mind could picture itself, it could also picture what wasn't yet real. It could dream, and that single ability to simulate possibilities inside the skull before acting changed everything. Now, survival didn't depend on instinct alone. Creatures could test futures in their minds before they leapt. The imagination became a laboratory, and through countless generations, that laboratory produced a mind capable not just of living, but of understanding life itself. Evolution built the human brain as its greatest experiment. 86 billion neurons, trillions of connections, a storm of electricity that could write poetry about itself. Human consciousness didn't appear overnight. It was carved slowly, neuron by neuron, pattern by pattern, by the pressures of survival, cooperation, and curiosity. The first humans didn't ponder the cosmos, they wondered where the next meal would come from. But even that wondering was revolutionary, because it meant they could imagine a world that wasn't right in front of them. They could picture what could be. And once you can imagine, you're no longer bound by the present. You can time travel, you can regret the past, you can hope for the future, you can suffer from possibilities. Consciousness had opened Pandora's box, the ape that dreamed. They say language created humanity. But in truth, it was imagination that made language possible. Before we could speak, we dreamed. Before we could speak, we dreamed. In dreams, the brain rehearsed the impossible. It stitched fragments of memory and emotion into surreal plays, testing meaning against madness. Every night, even before words, early humans entered a private cosmos, where lions could fly, ancestors could whisper, and fears could take shape. Dreams were the first theatre of the mind, where the universe practiced storytelling long before stories were told aloud. And out of those dreams, language was born. To speak is to turn inner experience into sound, to compress the infinite chaos of thought into vibration. The first words were not philosophy. They were warnings, directions, emotions, food, danger, help. But each word was a miracle, each word a bridge between two isolated minds. For the first time in the history of existence, awareness could communicate itself. The cosmos had found a way to echo its consciousness across skulls.